The metal bit into my wrists with each step, leaving marks that would fade long before the memory of that day ever could. They had come for me in the early hours of dawn, when the mist still clung to the earth like the last desperate breath of night. The arresting officers said nothing as they bound my hands behind my back, their faces masks of professional indifference. I had expected this moment for months, perhaps years, though not in the way it finally arrived. My name is irrelevant now. What I was before that day matters only as context for what I became. I had been living what most would consider a successful life, a career in theoretical physics, a modest apartment overlooking the university campus, and the quiet satisfaction of a mind engaged with the mysteries of quantum mechanics and dimensional theory. Yet beneath this veneer of accomplishment, I harbored a weakness that gnawed at me like a persistent infection. I was afraid. Afraid of failure, afraid of judgment, afraid of the very boldness that my research demanded. My colleagues saw determination where I felt only the trembling uncertainty of a man walking on ice too thin to support his weight. Every presentation I gave was accompanied by sleepless nights of self-doubt. Every paper I published carried with it the secret terror that I would be exposed as a fraud, an impostor in the halls of genuine brilliance. This fear had become my prison long before the physical shackles ever touched my skin. The charges against me were complex, rooted in research that had pushed beyond the boundaries of acceptable scientific inquiry. I had been working on what I called dimensional membrane theory, the hypothesis that consciousness itself could serve as a bridge between parallel realities. The academic establishment had grown increasingly uncomfortable with my work, particularly after I began conducting experiments that bordered on what they deemed unethical human testing. The truth was more nuanced, as truth often is. I had been experimenting on myself, using a combination of electromagnetic field manipulation and consciousness-altering techniques to explore the barriers between dimensions. The university had discovered my unauthorized laboratory in the basement of the physics building, along with extensive documentation of experiments that violated numerous safety protocols and research ethics guidelines. As they led me through the corridors of the courthouse, past the cameras and the shouting reporters, I felt something unexpected stirring within me. It was not the shame or regret I had anticipated, but a strange sense of liberation. The worst had happened, my career was over, my reputation destroyed, my life as I had known it finished. Yet in that destruction, I found the first seeds of something I had never possessed before, genuine fearlessness. The trial proceeded with the mechanical precision of institutional justice. Expert witnesses testified about the dangers of my research. Former colleagues spoke with careful distance about my increasingly erratic behavior. The prosecutor painted a picture of a scientist who had lost touch with ethical boundaries in his pursuit of impossible theories. I listened to it all with growing detachment, as if watching the trial of a stranger. The man they described weak, desperate, grasping for relevance through increasingly dangerous experiments, was accurate enough. But he was also already dead, killed by the simple act of having his worst fears realized. What remained was something else entirely. When my turn came to speak in my defense, I stood before the court not with the trembling uncertainty that had characterized my previous life, but with the calm clarity of someone who had nothing left to lose. I did not deny the charges or attempt to minimize my actions. Instead, I spoke about the nature of scientific inquiry, about the necessity of pushing beyond comfortable boundaries, and about the tragedy of a species that had grown content with its limitations. You see before you a man who dared to question the fundamental nature of reality, I said, my voice carrying a strength I had never possessed before. You see someone who refused to accept that human consciousness was limited to this single dimension of existence. Yes, I broke your rules. Yes, I ignored your protocols. Because sometimes, to discover truth, one must be willing to sacrifice everything familiar and safe. The judge was unmoved by my words, as I had expected. The sentence was severe but not unexpected, 10 years in a maximum security facility, with the possibility of parole after 7. As they led me away in shackles once more, I felt no despair, no crushing weight of defeat. Instead, I felt something approaching anticipation. Prison was meant to break men, to reduce them to shadows of their former selves through isolation, routine, and the slow erosion of hope. For most, it succeeded. But I was not most men. The weakness that had defined my previous existence had been burned away in the crucible of public humiliation and professional destruction. What remained was something harder, more focused, and infinitely more dangerous. My cell was a concrete box measuring 8 by 10 feet, furnished with a narrow bed, a metal toilet, and a desk barely large enough to hold a single book. The walls were painted an institutional green that seemed designed to drain hope from the human spirit. Most inmates covered these walls with pictures of family, calendars counting down their remaining days, or crude artwork attempting to inject some humanity into the sterile environment. I left my walls bare. Instead, I used them as a canvas for equations, theories, and diagrams that I traced with my finger in the dim light of evening. The guards thought I had lost my mind, muttering to myself and gesturing at empty walls. They were not entirely wrong. I had lost my mind, in the sense that I had abandoned the limited thinking that had characterized my previous existence. In the absolute solitude of my cell, I continued my research with an intensity that would have been impossible in the distracting environment of the university. Without access to laboratory equipment, I turned my own consciousness into the experimental apparatus. I developed techniques for altering my brainwave patterns through controlled breathing, meditation, and what I came to call conscious frequency modulation. The other inmates avoided me, sensing something in my demeanor that marked me as different from the typical prisoner. I was not angry or bitter, as many of them were. I did not rage against the system that had imprisoned me or plot revenge against those who had condemned me. Instead, I possessed a quiet intensity that seemed to radiate from my very presence. During the mandatory recreational periods, while others lifted weights or played cards, I would sit in the corner of the yard and practice the consciousness exercises I had developed. I learned to enter states of awareness that seemed to exist outside the normal boundaries of space and time. In these states, I began to perceive things that should have been impossible. I started to see the prison not as a solid structure but as a collection of energy patterns, vibrating at specific frequencies that kept it locked into this particular dimension of reality. I could see the electromagnetic signatures of the guards, the prisoners, even the surveillance equipment that monitored our every move. Most remarkably, I began to perceive what I could only describe as dimensional thin spots, areas where the barrier between realities seemed weaker, more permeable. These perceptions might have been dismissed as the hallucinations of a mind under extreme stress, except for one crucial factor: they proved to be accurate. I could predict guard rotations by observing their energy patterns. I could sense the moods and intentions of other prisoners before they acted. I could even anticipate mechanical failures in the prison systems by observing fluctuations in their electromagnetic signatures. The warden, a pragmatic man named Henderson, began to take notice of my unusual abilities when I warned him about a planned riot 3 days before it was scheduled to occur. The intelligence proved accurate down to the smallest details: the instigators, the timing, even the specific grievances that would be used to justify the violence. Henderson was intelligent enough to realize that this information could not have been obtained through normal channels. He began visiting my cell regularly, ostensibly for routine inspections but actually to observe my behavior and attempt to understand what he was dealing with. Henderson was former military, a man who trusted his instincts, and those instincts told him that I was not what I appeared to be. "What are you?" he asked me during one of these visits, his voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than suspicion. "I am what happens when a man stops being afraid of losing everything," I replied. "I am what remains when weakness is burned away by circumstance." Henderson studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "The riots you predicted, the system failures you warned about, how did you know?" "I see things as they really are," I said simply. "Most people perceive only the surface of reality, the comfortable illusion of solid matter and linear time. But consciousness, properly trained, can perceive the underlying patterns that govern existence." "That sounds like mystical nonsense," Henderson said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely convinced of his own words. "Science and mysticism are simply different languages for describing the same phenomena," I replied. "Call it quantum consciousness, dimensional awareness, or enlightened perception, the labels matter less than the reality they attempt to describe." These conversations continued over months, and gradually Henderson began to understand that whatever I had become in this prison went far beyond simple criminal behavior. He started bringing me books on advanced physics, consciousness studies, and even esoteric philosophy. Not out of kindness, but out of genuine intellectual curiosity about what he was observing. The transformation I was undergoing was not merely mental or spiritual, it was physiological as well. The consciousness exercises I practiced were literally rewiring my brain, creating new neural pathways and altering the fundamental frequencies at which my mind operated. I could feel these changes occurring, could sense my awareness expanding beyond the normal limits of human perception. 3 years into my sentence, something extraordinary occurred. During one of my evening meditation sessions, I achieved a state of consciousness so altered, so removed from ordinary awareness, that I began to perceive what I could only describe as dimensional broadcasts, signals or transmissions that seemed to originate from other realities, other versions of Earth where history had unfolded differently. In one of these alternate realities, I perceived a version of our world that had developed along radically different lines. Technology had evolved not through mechanical and electronic means, but through direct consciousness manipulation. Beings in this reality had learned to alter matter and energy through focused intention, to communicate across vast distances through quantum entanglement of awareness, and to travel between stars by shifting their consciousness into higher dimensional frequencies. Most remarkably, I perceived that these beings had become aware of my observations. They were studying our reality just as I was studying theirs, and they had detected my presence in the dimensional space between worlds. The contact, when it finally came, was subtle at first, gentle influences on my dreams, slight alterations in the electromagnetic patterns around my cell, and an increasing sense that I was being evaluated by intelligences far more advanced than anything on Earth. The warden noticed the changes in me immediately. The electromagnetic anomalies around my cell were affecting the prison's monitoring equipment, causing cameras to malfunction and communication systems to experience strange interference patterns. Henderson was faced with phenomena that his rational, military-trained mind struggled to categorize or explain. "What's happening to you?" he asked during one of our conversations, his voice carrying a mixture of fascination and concern. "I am being prepared," I replied, though I was not entirely certain for what. "There are intelligences in other dimensions who have been monitoring our reality. They have noticed the consciousness experiments I've been conducting, and they appear to be interested in making contact." Henderson stared at me for a long moment, his practical mind warring with the evidence of his own senses. The monitoring equipment in my section of the prison was experiencing failures at a rate that defied statistical probability. Strange lights had been observed in the vicinity of my cell. Other prisoners reported unusual dreams when housed nearby. "Contact for what purpose?" Henderson asked finally. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I suspect it has something to do with the fundamental weakness that has characterized human civilization. We have become a species trapped by our own limitations, afraid to push beyond comfortable boundaries, content with incremental progress rather than revolutionary advancement." The truth was that I had undergone a complete philosophical and psychological transformation during my incarceration. The man who had entered this prison, weak, fearful, seeking approval from academic peers, had been systematically destroyed by the harsh realities of confinement and social rejection. What emerged was something entirely different, a consciousness unencumbered by the normal human fears of failure, rejection, or death. This transformation had not occurred through any mystical process or supernatural intervention. It was simply the natural result of being forced to confront my deepest fears and discovering that I could survive their complete realization. Once I had lost everything I thought I valued: career, reputation, freedom, social status, I found that what remained was stronger, clearer, and more focused than anything I had possessed before. The dimensional contacts became more frequent and more direct as months passed. I began to receive what I could only describe as consciousness downloads, direct transmissions of information that appeared in my mind with crystal clarity. These transmissions contain knowledge about the true nature of reality, the structure of dimensional space, and the relationship between consciousness and physical matter. I learned that what we call reality is actually a narrow band of frequencies within an infinite spectrum of possible existences. Consciousness, properly trained and focused, could serve as a tuning device, allowing awareness to shift between these frequency bands and perceive alternate versions of reality. The beings who were contacting me had mastered this ability thousands of years ago and had evolved into something that transcended the physical limitations that bound human civilization. More importantly, I learned why they had chosen to make contact with me specifically. Earth was approaching what they described as a dimensional convergence event, a naturally occurring phenomenon where the barriers between realities become temporarily permeable. During these events, which occurred roughly every several thousand years, it became possible for consciousness to shift between dimensions with relative ease. However, such events also posed significant dangers. Unprepared civilizations could experience massive disruptions as their reality became unstable, with people and objects spontaneously shifting between dimensions. The advanced beings who were contacting me served as what they called stabilization agents, helping primitive civilizations navigate these transitions safely. But they had learned through experience that they could not simply intervene directly. Civilizations had to produce their own representatives, individuals who had undergone the necessary consciousness transformation to serve as bridges between dimensions. I had been identified as a potential candidate for this role, not because of my scientific knowledge, but because of my willingness to destroy my own limitations. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, they communicated to me during one particularly intense contact session. You have demonstrated the fundamental requirement for interdimensional work, the complete abandonment of ego-based fears. As my sentence neared its end, the preparations for what was to come intensified. The consciousness downloads became more technical, containing specific information about how to maintain stability during dimensional transitions, how to communicate with beings whose thought processes operated on entirely different principles than human logic, and how to serve as a translator between radically different forms of consciousness. Henderson, who had been observing these changes with growing amazement, finally asked the question that had been building in his mind for months: "When you get out of here, what are you going to do?" "I am going to continue the work," I replied simply. "But not in any laboratory or university. The real work can only be done by consciousness that has been freed from the limitations of conventional thinking." 2 weeks before my scheduled release, the first physical manifestations began to appear. Strange lights were observed not just around the prison, but throughout the surrounding area. Local electromagnetic systems experienced unexplained failures. Most remarkably, several witnesses reported seeing unusual craft in the skies above the facility. Henderson made the decision to move me to an isolated section of the prison, ostensibly for security reasons but actually because he wanted to observe what was happening without interference from other inmates or staff. He had become convinced that something genuinely extraordinary was occurring, something that transcended his normal understanding of reality. "Are they coming for you?" he asked during what would be our final conversation before my release. "In a manner of speaking," I replied. "But not in the way you might imagine. The contact will not occur here, in this limited environment. It will happen when I am free to fully utilize the consciousness abilities I have developed." Henderson studied me with the keen attention of a man trying to memorize something he might never see again. "What should I tell people about what I've observed here?" "Tell them that consciousness is the most powerful force in the universe," I said. "Tell them that the limitations humans accept are self-imposed, and that anyone willing to destroy their weak self can transcend those boundaries." The day of my release arrived with an unusual stillness that seemed to permeate the entire facility. Even the most hardened criminals seemed subdued, as if sensing that something momentous was about to occur. Henderson personally escorted me to the gate, a procedure that was highly irregular but which he seemed compelled to perform. As the final locks disengaged and the gate swung open, I turned back to look at the prison that had served as the crucible of my transformation. The concrete walls and steel bars that had contained my body for 7 years seemed almost insubstantial now, temporary constructs in a reality that I had learned was far more fluid than most people imagined. "Good luck," Henderson said quietly, though his tone suggested he believed I would need something more than luck for whatever lay ahead. "Luck is for those who remain bound by uncertainty," I replied. "I go forward with absolute clarity about what I am and what I must do." Part 2, the dimensional bridge freedom, I discovered, was not the absence of physical constraints but the presence of unlimited possibility. As I walked away from the prison gates, carrying nothing but a small bag of personal belongings, I felt no anxiety about the uncertain future that lay ahead. The man who had entered that facility 7 years earlier would have been paralyzed by such uncertainty. But that man was dead, replaced by someone who had learned to find strength in the complete destruction of familiar limitations. The world had changed during my incarceration, but not in ways that mattered to my transformed consciousness. Technology had advanced, political landscapes had shifted, and social movements had risen and fallen. Yet the fundamental weakness of human civilization remained unchanged. The species was still trapped by self-imposed limitations, still afraid to push beyond comfortable boundaries, still content with incremental progress rather than revolutionary transformation. I made my way to a remote area outside the city, a place where the consciousness exercises I had perfected could be practiced without interference from the electromagnetic noise of urban civilization. The dimensional beings had communicated specific coordinates to me, a location where the barriers between realities were naturally thin and where the coming convergence event would be most accessible. The site was an abandoned quarry surrounded by dense forest, a place where decades of deep excavation had created what geologists might describe as a natural electromagnetic anomaly. But I could perceive its true significance. The quarry had been carved precisely at the intersection of dimensional membrane layers, creating a kind of natural portal that would become fully active during the convergence event. I established a simple camp in a cave overlooking the quarry floor, bringing with me only the most basic necessities. The advanced beings had made it clear that the final preparations could not be completed while surrounded by the distractions and limitations of normal human society. I needed isolation, silence, and the complete freedom to explore consciousness states that pushed far beyond ordinary human awareness. For 3 months, I lived in this isolation, practicing the consciousness techniques I had developed and refined in prison. But now, freed from the constraints of concrete walls and surveillance, I could push these exercises to their ultimate extremes. I learned to maintain altered consciousness states for hours at a time, to perceive multiple dimensions simultaneously, and to communicate directly with the advanced beings who were guiding this process. The information they shared with me during this period was staggering in its implications. Earth, I learned, was one of millions of inhabited worlds scattered across the dimensional spectrum. Most of these civilizations followed similar developmental patterns. They emerged from primitive beginnings, developed technology and social structures, reached a certain level of advancement, and then either transcended their limitations or destroyed themselves through their inability to overcome fundamental weaknesses. Humanity was approaching the crucial decision point in this cycle. The dimensional convergence event that was approaching would present an opportunity for the species to evolve beyond its current limitations. But it would also pose dangers that could result in civilization's destruction if not properly navigated. The advanced beings could not intervene directly because such intervention invariably proved counterproductive. Civilizations had to choose their own evolutionary path, had to find within themselves the strength to transcend their weaknesses. But they could work through individuals who had already undergone the necessary transformation, using them as bridges to help guide their species through the transition. You understand now why you were chosen, they communicated to me during one particularly intense contact session. Not because of your scientific knowledge, which is primitive by our standards, but because you demonstrated the willingness to completely destroy your weak self in service of a greater truth. As the convergence event approached, the dimensional barriers around the quarry began to thin noticeably. I could perceive overlapping realities, glimpses of alternate Earths where history had unfolded differently, where human civilization had made different choices, where the species had either transcended its limitations or succumbed to them completely. In some of these alternate realities, I saw versions of humanity that had learned to manipulate matter and energy through consciousness alone, that had spread across the galaxy not through mechanical technology but through dimensional travel, that had evolved into beings of pure awareness capable of existing across multiple reality layers simultaneously. In others, I saw the remnants of civilizations that had destroyed themselves through their inability to overcome fundamental limitations. Wars fought with weapons that could tear holes in reality itself. Societies that had collapsed under the weight of their own technological advancement because they lacked the wisdom to use their power responsibly. Entire planets rendered uninhabitable by experiments that had gone catastrophically wrong. The pattern was always the same: civilizations that learned to transcend their limitations evolved into something magnificent, while those that remained trapped by weakness and fear eventually destroyed themselves. The upcoming convergence event would determine which path humanity would follow. 6 months after my release from prison, the convergence event began to manifest in measurable ways. Electromagnetic anomalies appeared around the globe. Sensitive individuals reported unusual dreams and altered consciousness experiences. wildlife began exhibiting strange behavioral patterns, as if responding to frequencies beyond normal perception. More significantly, people began to disappear. Not in large numbers, and not in ways that attracted widespread attention, but individuals with certain types of consciousness sensitivity began to vanish without explanation. These were not abductions in any conventional sense, they were spontaneous dimensional shifts, caused by unstable barriers between realities. The advanced beings had warned me about this phase of the convergence. As the dimensional barriers weakened, consciousness that had been prepared for such transitions would begin to shift between realities spontaneously. Most of these individuals would return within hours or days, often with no memory of their experiences. But some would remain in alternate dimensions, and some entities from other realities would begin to appear in our world. It was during this phase that the first physical contact occurred. I was practicing advanced consciousness exercises in the cave overlooking the quarry when I became aware of a presence that was both alien and familiar. The awareness felt like something I had been in communication with for months, but now it possessed a physical dimension that had been absent from our previous contacts. Emerging from what appeared to be empty air, 3 figures materialized at the edge of the quarry. They were humanoid in general structure but clearly not human. Their proportions were subtly different, taller, more slender, with elongated skulls and large eyes that seemed to contain depths of intelligence far beyond anything in human experience. But what struck me most forcefully was not their physical appearance but the quality of their presence. These beings radiated an awareness so focused, so completely free of the fears and limitations that characterized human consciousness, that simply being in their proximity was like standing near a source of intense energy. They did not speak in any conventional sense, but communicated through direct consciousness contact that was far more precise and efficient than language. The information they shared was not filtered through the limitations of words but transmitted as complete conceptual packages that could be understood instantaneously. "The time for preparation is ending," they communicated. "The convergence event will reach full intensity within days. Your role as a bridge between realities is about to begin." They explained that what was approaching was not simply a natural phenomenon but a carefully orchestrated test. Advanced civilizations throughout the dimensional spectrum had learned to use convergence events as opportunities to identify species ready for evolutionary advancement. Civilizations that successfully navigated these transitions would be welcomed into a broader community of evolved beings. Those that failed would be left to work through their limitations over the course of additional thousands of years. "Your species faces a choice," they continued. "Either overcome the fundamental weakness that has characterized human civilization, or remain trapped in the cycle of limited thinking that has prevented genuine advancement." They showed me visions of what successful transition would mean for humanity. Not simply advanced technology or extended lifespans, but a complete transformation of consciousness that would allow the species to participate directly in the fundamental forces that shaped reality. Humans would learn to manipulate matter and energy through focused intention, to communicate across vast distances through quantum entanglement of awareness, and to explore the infinite dimensions of existence that lay beyond physical reality. But they also showed me the consequences of failure. Civilizations that could not overcome their limitations during convergence events typically experienced catastrophic social collapse as the dimensional instabilities triggered conflicts, technological failures, and mass consciousness disruptions. "The choice cannot be made for your species," they communicated. "It must emerge from within humanity itself. But we can work through individuals like you who have already undergone the necessary transformation." Over the following days, more beings arrived at the quarry site. They came not only from the advanced civilization that had been guiding my development, but from dozens of other evolved species throughout the dimensional spectrum. I began to understand that convergence events were monitored by a vast community of advanced beings who served as guides and observers for species undergoing evolutionary transitions. The quarry itself was transforming, becoming something that could no longer be described in purely physical terms. The electromagnetic anomalies I had sensed were intensifying into visible distortions of space and time. The air shimmered with energy patterns that bent light and created the impression of multiple realities occupying the same location simultaneously. In the center of the quarry floor, a structure began to manifest that defied conventional description. It was part architecture, part energy pattern, part consciousness construct. The advanced beings explained that this was a dimensional anchor, a device that would allow stable communication between realities during the peak of the convergence event. My role, they explained, would be to serve as a translator and guide when contact was established with human leadership. The transformation I had undergone in prison had prepared me to maintain conscious stability while interfacing with multiple dimensional realities simultaneously. Most humans would be overwhelmed by such contact, their consciousness fragmenting under the strain of perceiving too much expanded awareness too quickly. But, you have already destroyed the limitations that would make such contact dangerous, they communicated. You have learned to find strength in the complete absence of ego-based fears. As the convergence event reached its peak, governments around the world began to notice the anomalies that could no longer be dismissed or covered up. Satellite monitoring detected massive electromagnetic disturbances at specific coordinates globally. Military installations reported equipment failures and unusual atmospheric phenomena. Most significantly, the spontaneous dimensional shifts that had been occurring in isolated cases suddenly escalated to levels that could not be ignored. It was at this point that human authorities finally acknowledged that they were dealing with something beyond their understanding or control. Emergency protocols were activated, though no human government possessed procedures for managing a dimensional convergence event. In their desperation, they began searching for anyone who might have knowledge relevant to what was occurring. My name appeared on their lists because of my previous research into dimensional theory, despite the fact that I was a convicted criminal whose work had been discredited by the academic establishment. When government agents arrived at the quarry site, they found something that exceeded their worst fears and wildest speculations. The quarry had become a nexus point where multiple realities intersected visibly. Advanced beings from dozens of evolved civilizations maintained a presence that was undeniably real, despite the fact that it should have been impossible according to all known laws of physics. Most unsettling for the human authorities, these beings were clearly waiting for something specific to occur. The lead investigator, a woman named Dr. Sarah Chen who worked for a classified government agency dealing with anomalous phenomena, approached the situation with the kind of systematic thinking that her training had taught her. But, nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she encountered at the quarry. "What do they want?" she asked me during our first conversation, her voice carefully controlled despite the obvious stress she was under. "They want to determine whether humanity is ready to join the community of evolved civilizations," I replied. "The convergence event is a test. Your species must demonstrate that it has overcome the fundamental limitations that have prevented genuine advancement." Dr. Chen studied me with the intense attention of someone trying to determine whether she was dealing with a madman or with information that could prevent global catastrophe. The evidence before her eyes suggested the latter, despite the fact that it contradicted everything she had been trained to believe about reality. "What kind of test?" she asked. "The test is not imposed from outside," I explained. "It emerges naturally from the dimensional instabilities. Civilizations that have learned to overcome their limitations can navigate these instabilities successfully. Those that remain trapped by fear, aggression, and limited thinking typically destroy themselves." As we spoke, the dimensional anchor in the center of the quarry activated fully, creating a stable communication link between our reality and the broader community of evolved beings. Dr. Chen watched in amazement as representatives from dozens of advanced civilizations became visible through the dimensional interface. These beings possessed a quality of presence that was immediately recognizable as something beyond ordinary consciousness. They radiated awareness so focused, so completely integrated, that simply observing them provided insight into what human evolution might achieve. Most remarkably, despite their vastly different physical forms and evolutionary backgrounds, they all shared certain fundamental characteristics: complete absence of fear-based thinking, perfect integration of individual and collective awareness, and consciousness that operated on multiple dimensional levels simultaneously. The communication that followed was unlike anything in human history. Using me as a translator and consciousness bridge, the evolved beings shared information about the nature of reality, the structure of dimensional space, and the evolutionary path that all intelligent species must follow to transcend their limitations. They explained that consciousness was the fundamental force that shaped reality at every level, that what humans called physical laws were simply stable patterns of consciousness interaction, and that species which learned to work directly with consciousness could manipulate matter, energy, space, and time through focused intention. More importantly, they demonstrated that the weaknesses which had characterized human civilization, fear, aggression, limited thinking, inability to cooperate on a species level, were not permanent limitations but temporary developmental phases that could be transcended through conscious choice. Your species stands at the threshold, they communicated through me to Dr. Chen and the growing assembly of human observers. The convergence event will continue for several more days. During this time, the dimensional barriers will remain permeable, allowing consciousness to shift between realities. You can use this opportunity to experience directly what evolutionary advancement means, to understand the possibilities that lie beyond your current limitations. Dr. Chen, who had been taking careful notes throughout the communication session, looked up with a question that revealed the practical nature of her thinking. What specifically do we need to do? Nothing can be done from the outside, I translated. The transformation must occur from within each individual consciousness. But the convergence event creates conditions where such transformation becomes much easier to achieve. People who are ready can experience directly what it means to think and perceive beyond the limitations that have defined human consciousness. Over the following days, thousands of people made pilgrimages to dimensional nexus points that had appeared around the globe. Most came out of curiosity or desperation as conventional reality seemed increasingly unstable. But some came with a genuine readiness to transcend the limitations that had defined their existence. These individuals underwent profound transformation experiences as they encountered the expanded consciousness that the convergence event made available. They discovered directly that the fears and limitations they had accepted as permanent were actually temporary constructs that could be dissolved through conscious choice. More importantly, they learned that the destruction of these limitations did not result in chaos or loss of identity, but in the emergence of something far stronger, clearer, and more capable than what they had possessed before. A critical mass of transformed individuals began to emerge from these experiences. These people had undergone the same fundamental shift in consciousness that I had experienced in prison, but through voluntary choice rather than forced circumstances. They had learned to find strength in the complete abandonment of ego-based fears. As this critical mass developed, the entire character of the convergence event began to shift. What had initially appeared as dangerous instability began to resolve into patterns of enhanced possibility. The dimensional barriers, instead of creating chaotic overlap between realities, began to serve as bridges that allowed consciousness to explore multiple levels of existence simultaneously. The evolved beings who had been observing this process communicated their growing optimism about humanity's prospects. Your species is demonstrating the capacity for voluntary transformation, they shared. This is the crucial indicator of evolutionary readiness. But the most remarkable development occurred when several world leaders, desperate to understand and manage the crisis, agreed to undergo the consciousness expansion experience themselves. These individuals, presidents, prime ministers, and other heads of state entered the dimensional interface expecting to negotiate some kind of treaty or agreement with alien powers. Instead, they discovered that what they were encountering was not external alien intelligence, but their own consciousness freed from the limitations that had defined their thinking throughout their entire lives. The expanded awareness they experienced was not foreign, but familiar. It was what human consciousness had always possessed the potential to become. When these leaders returned from their experiences, they had been fundamentally transformed. Not in their essential personalities or values, but in their capacity to perceive beyond the fear-based thinking that had characterized international relations. They began to understand that the conflicts and competitions that had defined human civilization were not inevitable, but were simply products of limited consciousness that could be transcended. This is when the real test of the convergence event began. The question was no longer whether individual humans could transcend their limitations, but whether the species as a whole could reorganize its social, political, and economic structures based on expanded consciousness principles. Part 3. The Queen's recognition. The greatest revelations often come not through grand gestures but through moments of quiet recognition between equals. As the dimensional convergence event reached its peak intensity, something extraordinary occurred that would define not only the immediate outcome of humanity's test, but the trajectory of our species for millennia to come. Among the evolved beings who had gathered to observe humanity's transition, there emerged a presence that commanded immediate attention from all others. She materialized not through the dimensional interface like the other beings, but directly within the quarry itself, her consciousness so powerfully focused that reality seemed to reorganize itself around her presence. The other advanced beings, despite their own highly evolved states, showed clear deference to this individual. Through the consciousness bridge I maintained, I could sense that she represented something beyond ordinary evolutionary advancement. She was what they called a prime consciousness, a being who had achieved such complete integration of individual and universal awareness that she served as a focal point for entire galactic civilizations. Her physical form was striking in its combination of alien beauty and undeniable authority. Tall and ethereally graceful, with features that suggested both ancient wisdom and eternal youth, she radiated a presence that was simultaneously gentle and absolutely commanding. But what marked her as extraordinary was not her appearance but the quality of consciousness she embodied. Standing in her presence was like standing near the source of all possibilities. Her awareness was so completely free of limitation, so perfectly integrated, that she seemed to exist simultaneously across multiple dimensional levels. Yet despite this cosmic scope of consciousness, she was also immediately and personally present, capable of focusing her infinite awareness on specific individuals with laser-like intensity. When her attention turned to me, I experienced something that went far beyond ordinary communication. It was as if my entire consciousness was being examined, evaluated, and understood at levels I had not known existed. She perceived not only what I had become through the transformation process, but the precise path by which that transformation had occurred, the specific moments of choice that had led to the destruction of my limitations, and the potential that remained to be actualized. Remarkable, she communicated, though the word carried implications far beyond its simple meaning. You have achieved voluntary ego death while maintaining functional consciousness. This is the fundamental requirement for interdimensional work. Dr. Chen, who had been observing this interaction with growing amazement, stepped forward with the kind of courage that her scientific training had instilled in her. Who are you? She asked directly. Through me, the Queen, for that was how the other beings had begun referring to her in my consciousness, responded with information that restructured everything we thought we understood about the universe. I am what your species might become, she communicated. I represent the final stage of consciousness evolution that all intelligent species can achieve if they successfully transcend their limitations. I have come here not as an observer, but as a potential guide for humanity's next phase of development. She explained that prime consciousnesses like herself served as evolutionary catalysts throughout the universe, helping species navigate the most crucial transitions in their development. But such guidance could only be offered to civilizations that had demonstrated genuine readiness for advancement, and that readiness could only be proven through voluntary transformation of the kind that was occurring during the convergence event. Most species fail this test, she continued. They remain trapped by the very limitations that have brought them to the threshold of advancement. Fear of change, attachment to familiar patterns, inability to release control, these weaknesses prevent them from accessing the support that could accelerate their development. As she spoke, I became aware that she was simultaneously communicating with transformed individuals at every dimensional nexus point around the globe. The network of humans who had undergone consciousness expansion during the convergence event were all receiving the same information, creating a planetary web of awakened awareness that could serve as the foundation for species-wide transformation. But, then, something occurred that surprised even the Queen herself. Among the government officials who had gathered to observe the convergence event was a man whose presence I had barely noticed during the previous days. General Marcus Harrison was a career military officer whose reputation was built on tactical brilliance and absolute reliability under pressure. He had come to the quarry as part of the security detail, his role limited to ensuring the safety of the scientific observers. But Harrison had been quietly watching everything that transpired, his military-trained mind analyzing the patterns and implications of what he was witnessing. Unlike most of the other officials, who focused on the technological aspects of the phenomenon or its potential political ramifications, Harrison had recognized something that the others missed. The beings who had gathered here possessed a quality of consciousness that he associated with the greatest leaders he had known. When the Queen's attention briefly focused on him during her communication with Dr. Chen, Harrison did something that shocked everyone present, including myself. Without hesitation, without waiting for permission or protocol, he stepped forward and spoke directly to her. "I request permission to undergo the transformation process," he said, his voice carrying the kind of absolute certainty that characterized truly decisive leadership. Not as an observer or a representative of human government, but as an individual ready to destroy whatever limitations are preventing my species from achieving its potential. The Queen's response was immediate and profound. For the first time since her arrival, she physically moved, rising from her position with a grace that seemed to defy gravity. Her attention focused completely on Harrison with an intensity that made reality shimmer around them both. "You understand what this means?" she asked him directly, her consciousness interfacing with his without any need for me to serve as translator. "I understand that true leadership requires the willingness to sacrifice everything familiar in service of something greater," Harrison replied. "I understand that the man I have been is not capable of guiding my species through this transition. That man must die for something better to emerge." What happened next was unprecedented in the annals of interdimensional contact. The Queen stood, and, with that simple action, every being present, both human and alien, understood that something momentous was occurring. Prime consciousnesses did not rise for ordinary interactions. They did not show physical respect for unevolving beings. But she was standing for Harrison because she recognized something in him that even he did not yet fully understand. "You possess the fundamental requirement," she communicated to him, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate through multiple dimensions simultaneously. "You understand that true strength comes not from preserving what you are, but from destroying what you are not." The transformation that Harrison underwent was unlike anything I had witnessed during the Convergence event. While other humans had experienced consciousness expansion as a gradual process of discovery and integration, Harrison's transformation was immediate and complete. His military training, rather than being an obstacle to transcendence, became the very mechanism through which he achieved it. He had spent decades learning to operate under extreme stress, to make life or death decisions without hesitation, to function effectively when everything familiar was stripped away. These skills translated directly into the consciousness work required for dimensional transcendence. Where others struggled to release their attachments to familiar patterns of thinking, Harrison simply executed the transformation like a military objective. The Queen observed this process with growing amazement. Through the consciousness bridge I maintained, I could sense her recognition that Harrison represented something unprecedented, a being who could achieve voluntary ego death not through years of preparation and practice, but through the direct application of leadership principles that had been tested under the most extreme conditions. "This is why you were chosen as the bridge," she communicated to me as Harrison's transformation reached completion. "Not to translate between species, but to demonstrate what becomes possible when consciousness is freed from limitation. And now you have guided another to the same realization." But Harrison's transformation was only the beginning of what proved to be the most crucial phase of the Convergence event. As word spread through military and government networks about what he had experienced, other leaders began to arrive at the quarry site. Not politicians seeking to negotiate or scientists hoping to study the phenomenon, but individuals who recognized that they were witnessing an opportunity for the kind of fundamental change that occurs once in the lifetime of a species. These leaders, military commanders, intelligence officials, heads of international organizations, possessed the kind of consciousness that was already partially prepared for transformation. They had been tested by responsibility, forged by difficult decisions, and trained to operate beyond the comfort zones that limited most human thinking. When they encountered the Queen and witnessed Harrison's transformation, they understood immediately what was being offered. This was not contact with alien beings seeking conquest or negotiation. This was an opportunity to evolve beyond the limitations that had characterized human consciousness since the beginning of recorded history. One by one, these leaders chose to undergo the transformation process. Each experience was unique, reflecting the specific limitations and strengths that each individual brought to the process. But the outcome was consistent. Beings who had been trapped by the fears and limitations that defined ordinary human consciousness emerged as something far more capable, far more aware, and far more integrated. The Queen observed this cascade of voluntary transformation with what I could only describe as deep satisfaction. Through our consciousness connection, I sensed her recognition that humanity was demonstrating something rare among evolutionary transitions: the ability to change through choice rather than through crisis. Most species require catastrophic circumstances to motivate transformation, she communicated. They change only when their survival depends on it. But, you are demonstrating the capacity for voluntary evolution, change chosen not from desperation, but from recognition of greater possibility. As more leaders underwent transformation, the character of international relations began to shift in ways that would have seemed impossible just days earlier. Conflicts that had persisted for decades suddenly found resolution as the consciousness that had maintained them was transcended. Economic systems that had been based on scarcity thinking began to reorganize around principles of abundance and cooperation. Most remarkably, the network of transformed leaders began to function as a collective intelligence that transcended national boundaries and political affiliations. They had retained their individual personalities and perspectives, but had gained access to a level of awareness that allowed them to perceive the underlying unity that connected all human experience. Dr. Chen, who had been documenting these developments with scientific precision, approached me with a question that revealed the magnitude of what was occurring. "Are we witnessing the evolution of humanity into something fundamentally different?" she asked. "We are witnessing humanity remember what it has always had the potential to become," I replied. "The consciousness that these leaders are accessing has always existed within every human being. The convergence events simply created conditions where that potential could be actualized more easily." But, the Queen's response to Dr. Chen's question was even more significant. "You are witnessing the emergence of a species that has chosen evolution over limitation," she communicated directly to Dr. Chen, her consciousness encompassing the scientist with gentle but absolute clarity. "This choice, once made by a critical mass of your population, becomes irreversible. Your species has crossed the threshold." The implications of this statement were staggering. Humanity had not simply passed a test or demonstrated readiness for advancement. According to the Queen, our species had undergone an irreversible transformation that would continue to unfold regardless of external circumstances. "What happens now?" Dr. Chen asked, her scientific mind already working to understand the practical implications of this development. "Now you begin the work of rebuilding your civilization on the foundation of expanded consciousness," the Queen replied. "The leaders who have transformed will serve as catalysts for broader change. But, the transformation itself must eventually encompass every member of your species who chooses to participate." She explained that species-wide consciousness evolution was not an event but a process that could span several generations. The critical factor was that enough individuals had achieved the breakthrough to create what she called a transformation cascade, a self-reinforcing pattern of change that would continue to spread throughout human civilization. "Those who choose to evolve will find the path increasingly accessible," she continued. "Those who choose to remain limited will find their limitations increasingly unsustainable. This is not judgment, but natural law. Consciousness seeks its highest expression, and will reorganize reality to support that expression." As the peak intensity of the convergence event began to subside, the Queen made preparations to depart. But, before leaving, she did something that would be remembered as one of the defining moments in human history. She approached me directly, her presence so focused and powerful that reality seemed to crystallize around us. For a moment, we existed in a bubble of expanded awareness that encompassed both individual consciousness and cosmic perspective. "You have served as the bridge between what humanity was and what it is becoming," she communicated. "But, your work is not finished. You must now help guide the integration process as your species learns to function with expanded consciousness." She shared with me detailed information about the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead for humanity. The transformation cascade would not be uniform. Some individuals would evolve rapidly while others would resist change. Social institutions would need to be rebuilt to accommodate expanded consciousness. New technologies would emerge that worked directly with consciousness rather than mechanical principles. Most importantly, she explained that humanity would gradually become aware of its role in the broader community of evolved civilizations. As our species stabilized at higher levels of consciousness, we would be invited to participate in galactic and interdimensional projects that transcended anything we had previously imagined. The universe is vast beyond your current comprehension, she shared. But consciousness, properly developed, can encompass that vastness. Your species is beginning a journey that will ultimately lead to participation in the fundamental forces that shape reality across multiple dimensions. As she prepared to leave, the Queen turned back one final time, her attention encompassing not just those present at the quarry but the entire network of transformed humans around the globe. Remember, she communicated with absolute authority and infinite compassion, the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. You have proven this truth. Now live it. With these words, she dissolved back into the dimensional matrix from which she had emerged, leaving behind a world that had been fundamentally changed by her presence. But her departure was not an ending, it was a beginning. The transformation she had witnessed and validated would continue to unfold, spreading through human consciousness like ripples from a stone dropped into still water. The convergence event was ending, but the real work was just beginning. Humanity had chosen evolution over limitation, growth over stagnation, possibility over fear. And, in that choice, we had discovered what we had always possessed the potential to become, beings of expanded consciousness capable of transcending any limitation we had the courage to release. As I stood in the quarry watching the last dimensional distortions fade away, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this moment. The man who had entered prison 7 years earlier, weak, fearful, seeking approval from others, had been completely destroyed by the crucible of circumstance. What remained was something far stronger, far clearer, and far more capable. But, more importantly, I had learned that this transformation was not unique or special. It was the natural result of any consciousness that chose growth over limitation, possibility over fear, truth over comfortable illusion. The process was available to every human being who possessed the courage to undergo it. The shackles that had bound me to limitation were not physical restraints but mental constructs. And, the moment I had spoken my truth in that courtroom years ago, the moment I had chosen authenticity over approval, those shackles had begun to dissolve. Now humanity itself was learning the same lesson. The limitations that had defined our species were not permanent features of human nature, but temporary constructs that could be transcended through conscious choice. We had always possessed the key to our own liberation. We had simply been afraid to use it. But fear, I had learned, was the only true prison. And, once that prison was voluntarily entered and then consciously transcended, nothing could ever again hold consciousness captive. The Queen had stood when I spoke because she recognized a truth that transcends species and dimensions, that beings who have learned to destroy their own limitations possess a strength that no external force can overcome. They become, in the deepest sense, indestructible not because they cannot be harmed, but because they have learned to find opportunity in every circumstance, growth in every challenge, and possibility in every limitation. This was humanity's gift to the universe, and the universe's gift to humanity. We had chosen to become beings who could never again be defined by our limitations, because we had learned to find our strength in their complete transcendence. The work would continue. The transformation would spread. And consciousness, freed from the constraints that had bound it for millennia, would explore possibilities that had previously existed only in the realm of dreams. We had become the species that stood when truth was spoken, that recognized strength in the voluntary destruction of limitation, and that chose growth over every comfortable cage that had previously contained our potential. The Queen's recognition had been more than validation, it had been invitation. Humanity was ready to take its place among the evolved beings who shaped reality across the dimensional spectrum. We had proven ourselves worthy not through conquest or achievement, but through the simple courage to destroy what we were not in service of what we could become. And, in that destruction, we had found the one strength that could never be taken from us, the strength that comes from having nothing left to lose except the illusions that had never served us anyway.